Experience. Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, presented by Underdog Fantasy. Code Mayo at Underdog Fantasy right now. Get you a or a bonus deposit of up to $250. Best ball season is upon us for NFL, plus every other sport for the Pick'em games going on all the time. Just remember to use code Mayo when you sign up, because we're going to have a ton of content coming for you. This is the unofficial kickoff to the Pat Mayo Experience NFL content season. We're doing division previews. Today, the AFC South, team by team, odd by odd, player by player, then the all-fantasy team at the end. And if we're going to kick off football season, we got to get the longest-lasting guest on the Pat Mayo Experience who still talks about football, Jake Ciely, theathletic.com. My man, how's your throat?
The throat's getting there. Yeah, I ended the cruise with the wonderful. We made it all the way through. We're doing great. Start feeling it the last day. Went to the ER at 3 a.m. when I got back. It was not in Mexico like somebody thought. And I found out I had super special Caribbean strep, and then it turned into bronchitis. So powering through, man. If I cough on their show, I apologize for my first time being on the show in a while.
Well, let's start with the Houston Texans. They are the favorites in the division of the AFC South. They are plus 105, so a $100 wager will earn you $105. There's more, just a smidge more than double your money. Take a look at their win total this year. It's over 9.5, but that's been juiced up to minus 140. So a lot of action coming in on the over 9.5 for the Houston Texans. And they are one of the few teams in football who actually didn't make any coaching changes. Both coordinators are the same. Obviously, D'Amico Ryans is back. They're riding a high coming in off last season. Tank Dell shall return for them, hopefully, by week 1. They pick up Stefan Diggs. Joe Mixon is the running back now. Things are looking good for the Houston Texans, right?
Yeah, I think they are. My Houston Texans. There you go. Let me grab the hat. My Houston Texans. I actually think, on paper, clearly the division favorites. I would say, the only concern here is that if it's one of those, the addition of all those parts, being the two veterans, ends up just like not working. Kind of. I was thinking like old Celtics from a few years ago for, by the way, just winning the NBA championship, but like kind of like when they brought in like the Garnett pieces, and it's kind of like it looked like everything should work because you had the young team, you had develop it, and then you bring in the vets who know how to do it. And then for some reason, the chemistry is just not there. Again, I'm just saying, I don't believe that's going to happen. That's the only way this looks like it could go wrong, because everything's set up for success. Everybody expects CJ Stroud to take a step forward. But if we're talking fantasy purposes, I have a feeling that I'm going to have almost nothing of CJ Stroud on my teams just because of his cost at this point.
Well, there's the cost associated with it. And when we're looking into these things, what is the playoff schedule? If you get to the finals of best ball, what's that going to be in week 17? And the Texans' final three of their final 4 games. We don't care about week 18. Week 15... at home against the Dolphins, at the Chiefs in week 16, at home against the Ravens in week 17. How would you grade those matchups, knowing what we know now? Obviously, we're going to know more in week 14, but we're not from the future, Jake.
No, we're not. And I always compare, we've been doing this, as you mentioned, forever. There's a year, I don't remember what the exact year was, but at the beginning of the season, it was play your players against the Giants and avoid the Saints. And I remember it because it was the year that the Falcons faced the Saints 2 of the final 3 weeks for fantasy purposes. And everybody's like, ooh, you got to be worried about Julio Jones. And that very year, it flipped. And all of a sudden, the Giants defense at the end of that year was one to stay away from, and it was exploit the Saints. So I bring that up to only say is this could change in season. As you mentioned, we're not from the future. But on paper, if I was grading that as like an entire, not game by game, I mean, we're talking like, 8 out of 10 difficulty? Now, the only thing that seems worse as of right now, if you went across the league, was probably the Steelers' schedule. But that's more like the Steelers as a whole. That finish is definitely one of the top 3 worst as of right now on paper. So it's something, especially if you're playing best ball, especially if you're looking for those weeks where you might want to steer away from. Again, because not only do you bring up the schedule, as you said, go back to my point on the cost of it too. It's not like where it's, oh, well, what if the Carolina Panthers, you and I talked a few weeks ago, what if the Carolina Panthers surprise and that's a sneaky stack? You're not paying the CJ Stroud price, the Nico Collins price, the Stephon Diggs price, and even the Joe Mixon price to stack this team. So you have an expensive cost on top of a worrisome schedule. Again, on paper, it could be cakewalk by that time. But it's one that, especially for best ball purposes, seems like you might want to actually steer the opposite direction.
Do you think this is a situation, and you've brought this up many times, where, yeah, the CJ Stroud price is getting up there. He's being drafted as QB6 right now, around pick number 59 overall. But that's in best ball. I think in season-long leagues, it'll probably be a little bit lower because quarterbacks get inflated in best ball. However, Would you just rather own Stroud than own the receivers? Because do we have it seems like everyone's in on Nico Collins. Like Nico Collins is the guy. I would agree with that, but I wouldn't say that's like lock that he is going to be their number one fantasy receiver. It could be Stefan Diggs in a resurgence.
Hell, there's an opportunity where it could be Tank Dell. Like I want to put odds on that, especially because you said it. We're assuming he's ready for week 1. But yeah, that's what I used to say: buy the cake, not the icing. CJ Stroud is the cake. So I know people want to stack in best ball, and I agree, good strategy. But in maybe seasonal, and if you can't, it's not the end of the world if you don't get the stack that you want with your quarterback in best ball. So if you just got Stroud, I wouldn't hate it. I'd still like to at least pair one of them, but I think it comes down to more for me is not even just take Stroud and worry about the wide receivers for somebody else's team. It comes down to the fact that if CJ Stroud is going to be a top 5 quarterback, it's not going to be on his legs. And there's guys right with him and right behind him who are going to even chip in 300 or 400, maybe 600, 700, 800, 900. And CJ Stroud basically has to go out there and have 4,500 yards, 30-plus touchdowns, which is very doable for him. But even as we just saw with Patrick Mahomes last year, all he takes is a little tick back, and you're not even a top 10 quarterback. I mean, we're not even talking top 5. He's right now 5th, I think. You're not even top 10 just on a really good passing season. But for fantasy purposes, we know what the ding is. It's a huge knockoff when you're not going to be running a ton and you need 30-plus touchdowns, probably mid-30 touchdowns, to reach that top 3 or 4 status and break into that tier with Hurts and Allen and Lamar. Patrick Mahomes wasn't even a top 10 quarterback last year on points per game. And if you look at his numbers, it wasn't like he had that bad of a year.
Would you rather draft Anthony Richardson or CJ Stroud?
At cost, Anthony Richardson. And yes, cost matters. I would rather have Richardson.
Jaden Daniels or Anthony Richardson?
Ooh, again, cost. Just because they could actually be the same. You strip their names, it could be the exact same stat line. And for that reason, I would take Jaden Daniels.
So you would prefer both those guys over Stroud on a cost basis?
Yes, on a cost basis. Obviously, straight up, no way in the world. I would take Stroud every time.
Okay, so Nico Collins is being drafted as the 20th player off the board, wide receiver number 14. Too high or too low?
The 3 Bears, just right. I actually thought I was going to be one of the highest on Nico Collins, but that's like right there, just right. So I don't have a problem with it, but it's kind of more of where's your strategy going in your draft, because he falls into a tier which is enormous in my opinion. I think there's a huge tier where you can start talking about having like the Devontae Adams, Ayuk conversation, and it includes Nico Collins and keeps going past him down into like the Jalen Waddle, Pittman, Devonta Smith range. So I'm okay with it. It's not going to be like I'm shooting to get him. It would kind of come down to like the stack thing. Like if I'm drafting that range and I want to try and chase this stack, I can say like, all right, well, he'll tie-break Nico Collins over Chris Olave. But if it's straight up and I'm just going through the draft, it's not going to be like, I got to get Nico Collins every single time. I'd probably mix and match a few opportunities.
Stefan Diggs is pick number 30, wide receiver number 22. That feels a shade high if Collins is going to be that good.
It does. And I think that Diggs is in that range for the people who think that he could still be the number 1, which is a possibility we just talked about. And if he is the one, and then you're just flipping these. Diggs finishes as 14, 15, kind of bounces back from last year. Hell, we remember the beginning of the season, he was on pace for a lot better than that. He was on pace for top 5. It's just that second half of the season was beyond miserable. Was that a Brady product? Was that the offense as a whole? Maybe Josh Allen, the connection not there. Maybe Stefan Diggs taking a step back. But it does feel a shade high because you mentioned, like, if Nico Collins is Nico Collins, what's the likelihood that Diggs finishes there with Nico Collins did what he did last year, unless everybody goes up? And then maybe we should just be drafting all 4 of them, because if the only way that happens is Stroud is throwing for like 5,000 yards and 35 to 40 touchdowns, which isn't likely to happen. And I got to tell you, like, I would feel better at Diggs at that spot, even with Nico Collins doing what some people think he can, if Tank Dell was like out for half the season, because we've seen wide receivers on the same team both finish as wide receiver 1s. But it's the Tank Dell factor. He's not just some schlub third option. So I think that's the bigger concern for me, is that Tank Dell's healthy. I don't love Diggs here. Diggs here feels like a value if you think he's going to be the one. Nico Collins is actually the bad pick at 14.
Well, Tank Dell is going 6 picks later. He's wide receiver number 26. So everyone's just all in on this
See,
offense.
that's just
So, I mean, I guess you kind of got to pick right, or pick two of the three right, or pair one of these guys with Stroud and Dalton Schultz later on for the savings.
And that's really what comes down. And then you have Joe Mixon too. It's not like they brought in Joe Mixon to just be like, you're only going to get 900 yards on the ground. Joe Mixon isn't the Cincinnati volume, which is the concern of Joe Mixon, but he's not a schlub, and he's still pretty good, and he's going to balance this offense even more. So, again, I love the Texans. And I know part of that's tongue-in-cheek from the past years we've been talking about, but I'm a big fan of the Texans. Why do you need Stroud to throw for 4,800 yards if you now have Joe Mixon on top of it? Unless he gets hurt, obviously, but it's not. He's better than Devin Singletary. Like I just don't get. I just don't get the cost associated, as you just brought up. Like if Tank Dell's going there, somebody's a bad pick. That's what it comes down to. Somebody's a bad pick with all these costs.
Do you think, like, if you had to have a Texan, the move would be just wait till pick number 61 and take Joe Mixon and avoid the passing game, and hopefully he just rushes in a bunch of touchdowns?
I think Joe Mixon's a great value at 61 right now, yes.
Okay. What about Dameon Pierce as his backup? Would he be a preferred handcuff for you, or is he just kind of like, if you have to?
If you have to, because I think given what happened last year, I don't know that he's definitively, like, Joe Mixon gets hurt in week 3. I don't think this is like Jerome Ford with Nick Chubb last year where it's going to be 80% him. I think this could be a chance opportunity where Dameon Pierce gets a second chance to be the guy, but it's not that kind of workload. It's not even the Joe Mixon workload. It could just be like a 50, and then the other 50%'s the other dudes down the depth chart.
I guess the other guys to consider, Dalton Schultz is pick number 130 right now, tight end number 13. It seems like the cost associated with the receivers just means that Dalton Schultz can't do anything. But if all these guys are going to go super highly, it does seem like a piece that you would want to fit in, doesn't it?
It seems like a piece that you might as well for that cost, because at that point, one of the three get hurt, don't hit, maybe Tank Dell's not himself until late in the season. Maybe Stephon Diggs is just washed. And then there will be a third option of some value. And if it's Dalton Schultz, and if Dalton Schultz just repeats last year, that's a enormous value at that point. So, yeah, that kind of feels like if you're going to go for this stack, it's almost like a why not. And even if you're waiting on tight end, you kind of played the game of like, I'll take 2 or 3 flyers in best ball. Schultz at that cost, that's almost like a why not pick. Like, what's the downside? He doesn't hit? Okay. He's only picked, what did you say, 130? There's no reason kind of not to do it.
The only other name being drafted right now on the Texans is Noah Brown, who just continues to get pushed down the depth chart. But, I mean, he won me a bunch of money last year, daily fantasy-wise, picking him up and playing him after Tank Dell went out, and even when Robert Woods was injured for a while. And like Nico would go out. He had these huge games. Do you think there's any value to him should anything happen to one of those 3 receivers? Would he just instantly get slotted back in, and all of a sudden you have a cheap guy who could bust off 5 for 150 and 2 touchdowns any given week?
Yes. And so 100%. When we talked last year when this happened, the Tank Dell injury is the one that kind of replicates that role is Noah Brown. Not physically and stylistically, not, but production-wise and their role, they're very similar in what they do for the Texans. So yes, especially if Tank Dell not ready week 1, or Tank Dell just re-injures himself or whatever it is, and he's gone. My concern would be if I think Noah Brown can fill in a lot of what Nico Collins does. My concern would be if Diggs got hurt. I don't think Noah Brown fits replacing what Diggs is supposed to bring to this offense on paper. I think Tank Dell would step up, and Noah Brown still is the third. Yeah, sure, he could go 3 for 100 and have a day. I just don't think it would be as valuable. But all that being said, your point is what remains. If one of the 3 gets hurt, Noah Brown's the one that's going to step up until he hopefully doesn't get hurt.
A lot of money on the over, as I talked about. Minus 140 on the 9.5 over right now. Don't they kind of feel like a step back team? I know everything points to they're going to be awesome. I just don't trust teams in this division ever.
So it's not even so much the division. I would still lean the over. The first half of the schedule is not as worrisome as the second half, but if the first half of the schedule, again, like we said at the beginning of the show, this could change. This schedule could not look anything like what we think on paper halfway through. But you didn't even go right before that bye, which, by the way, they have a week 14 bye. At Jacksonville, Tennessee's fine, but at Dallas, Detroit, and I'm going backwards in the schedule from there. Even at Jets, like their schedule from the midpoint of the season is not that great. And I bring that up to say is if they get off on the wrong foot, if they start off slow and it's a surprise and like, holy crap, what happened to the Texans? They're 2-4. That's not a schedule to easily rebound and get back into the winning ways where they could very easily finish the season 8-9, 9-8. And I mean, even just the 9-8, you lost, you're under. So I would lean towards over, but because of where the money is too on top of it, I don't love it as much as I love the team in my heart.
Let's move to the Jags. Did Lawrence get his extension? He got it, right?
Yeah, he got it. He got insane money.
It's crazy because I've been kind of on the boat, and I kind of prod Gary in about this all the time when it comes to Tua and his extension, that if I was the Dolphins owner, the Dolphins GM, whoever it was inside the Dolphins building, that I would throw myself in front of a Tua extension, because that just seems like once Tyreek retires or moves on, that's going to be a really terrible contract. And maybe there's nothing that they can do with it. Although I've seen a lot of people come to Lawrence's defense as, oh, he's not as bad as maybe you think. Like, he went from being all generation, like the next Andrew Luck, the next Peyton Manning, to he kind of sucks. And I don't know where I'm really at with him, but what are you going to do is kind of those things. And I do think that he's better than Tua. At least the upside potential with Trevor Lawrence is still there. I do worry that, like, he's just kind of mediocre, though.
Yeah, I mean, we just did my show, and Meany brought up the fact that somebody put out a stat line where his numbers are pretty similar to Daniel Jones' first 3 seasons of his career. Yeah, I saw your face. That's not what you want to hear. I mean, we're just talking about how miserable Daniel Jones' $40 million contract. And no, Trevor Lawrence isn't Daniel Jones. But I made this comparison, and not to talk about my own life with like trying to find a house, but it feels like the housing market right now is you're paying overvalue because of where we're at. Just like the housing market, the opportunity for what's available out there, the inventory basically is so thin that's like, hey, I have something that's potentially good. Instead of like paying $55 million for a great place, you're paying $55 million for like, yeah, I see the potential here. Like, if I just fix this, this, and this. But if we were talking 5 years ago, you're not making that investment. And that's the Tua thing too, is I even said on the show with Meany, I said, do you really want to tie yourself to Tua for the rest of like the next 6-7 years at 55 million or even 50 million? What's the big difference if you want to make comparison wise between Tua and like a Derek Carr? So the money makes sense if they believe that Lawrence still has the potential to get to what we thought he was in the draft. Everybody called him generational. They've done more again to set this team up for success around him with the wide receivers. But all that being said, objectively, from what we've seen so far, Trevor Lawrence isn't even that different from Derek Carr. Like, Trevor Lawrence and Derek Carr, to date, are kind of the same quarterback.
The Jags are plus 275, so almost 3-1 to win the AFC South. A huge change from a year ago where they were the overwhelming favorites. Their win total, however, is minus 8.5. That's even on both sides at minus 110. So the market has hit that one on the head. No one knows what to do with that over-under. Their coaching remains the same. It's going to be Doug Peterson back, second year as the head coach. Press Taylor continues to be the offensive coordinator for the second consecutive year. And to take a look at their schedule, they have a week 12 bye. Then they finish in the fantasy season with Houston, Tennessee, the Jets in week 15, Vegas in week 16, and then the Tennessee Titans in week 17. I don't like that Jets, but everything else looks pretty good.
Which is why I don't mind them as the bet to win the division, because you're talking about, again, just a year ago, they were the prohibitive favorites. I mean, massive favorites. And all it takes is the division beats themselves up, but differently than the Texans. You mentioned the final stretch of the schedule. That's a lot of control your own destiny right there with Houston, Tennessee, Indianapolis, and 4 of their last 6 games coming out of their bye. That's the division's in play, and you do what you need to do. The division's yours, even with Houston out there. So I don't mind them as hey, they just still really good defense. Like Trevor Lawrence, even if he repeats last year, Trevor Lawrence still good enough for the offense to, I mean, what was the division last year? Was 9? They were both had 9, them and the Colts. Yeah, they were both 9-8, just one behind the Texans. I don't hate that pick. But actually, if you told me today, Pat, if you said, hey, here's $100, you have to put it on the Texans or the Jaguars to win division. And of course, I'm factoring in the money and the plus money. I would put it on the Jaguars at the plus money.
Well, the way that you could look at it, that if you bet $100 on the Texans to win, you would return $205. If you put $50 each on the Jags and the Colts, and one of those won, you'd lock yourself into like a profit of $100. So basically the same.
Yeah. So, and I don't mind that even just straight up just for the Jaguars, but that's another good way of looking at it. So.
Yeah. To take a look at the fantasy guys right now, like everyone's down the board. Everyone's high on the Texans. They're all up the board. All the Jags, they're way down the board. Obviously, they lose Calvin Ridley to the Titans at receiver, and they end up bringing in Gabe Davis away from the Bills. But Etienne is still the one who's going the highest of any Jag, and it's not even really that high. Pick number 43, running back number 10. Do we think that he gets the same workload as last year?
Yes, I don't think. I think it'll be slightly down, but I don't think it's going to be down as much as people. Like, how quickly we forget? We did this last year. This same time, well, actually now a few weeks ago, this time last year, it was Etienne's workload's going to come down. Etienne's not going to see as much. And then, they draft Tank Bigsby, and there's going to be a workload going to his route. And if everybody looks and remembers, so he had 74% of the running back touches as that first year. Last year, Pat, 74.3. It went up 0.3. And I'm not saying like, 0.3. It was basically the same. Nothing changed. And they talked about easing his workload. So this is the second year in a row, easing the workload. Sure. But what does that mean? 68%? And I'm not going to sweat it that much. My biggest concern for Etienne continues to be the concern for Etienne. It's just getting into the end zone. So I'm not that even if you told me he was 74 and dropped to 64%, I'm still not concerned about Etienne's yardage. I'm just concerned about the touchdown. So 10 feels fine. If he started getting into the end zone more consistently, he could actually return value at that spot. But it's similar to what I said before with like Nico Collins. It feels like a fine spot. I just feel like Etienne's just kind of for me. Like, that's okay. You don't have to have this wild take on everybody to be like, oh, he's going to smash this spot, or he's going to be a bust, or like have to have all the shares. Some players can just be fine for their cost, and I think that's Etienne. He's fine where he is.
Watching so many Jags games, as I did a year ago, they tried to make Tank Bigsby happen in the red zone sometimes. That was wildly ineffective. Their better backup was Dearness Johnson, who looked good every time he came into the game.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you there. And now I think Dearness Johnson's over with the Giants now in the offseason. But yeah, or no, wait, no, he's back again, right?
Yeah,
he's back again.
He's back in Jacksonville.
Yeah, so like I'm not even saying that like so much for like, oh, definitely go draft Johnson, but I think this similar to the Giants, maybe that's where my thought process was going. Like, if Singletary gets hurt, the answer is like sometimes the answer is nobody. Like, it could just be, it's going to be a mess. The answer was nobody when it was Barkley. Like, Barkley gets hurt, it's a mess. You don't want any Giants behind him. If Etienne gets hurt, the answer might just be nobody. Like, I mean, at cost, Dearness Johnson, absolutely pick him in best ball, because if he is the guy. But just for standard redraft, it might just be like, don't waste your bench spot on Bigsby or Johnson, because they might just split and cannibalize each other. The better one might be like a Trey Benson or a Marshawn Lloyd or something like that. Just kind of sidebarring on that. But sometimes it's okay. Another one that's like, it's okay if Etienne is just fine where he is. Sometimes the answer is also like, you don't want the backups. You don't want to spend the cost, but for Johnson's cost, it's warranted just to take the flyer.
He's not even he doesn't even have an ADP in best ball right now.
I was going to say, does he? I was curious what it was.
Well, Tank Bigsby does, but I think at this point in time, and maybe Tank Bigsby got a lot better during the offseason, but I would rather have the upside of Dearness Johnson right now.
Because one's free, quote unquote.
Well, I mean, they're both quote unquote free. Like, in most, right, Bigsby's going as running back number 60. I just think Johnson's better.
Oh, okay. Hey, I wouldn't disagree with you much on that. I think there's at worst case, they're the same. I'm actually looking to see what Tank Bigsby was on the goal line rush percentage for actually getting to the end zone.
Would he have one touchdown?
He had 3 goal line rushes. Yeah, that's it.
Is goal line considered, is that 5 and in?
Inside the 5.
Okay.
Yeah. Goal to go rushes. Bigsby only had 2 goal to go inside the 10, but then he had 3 inside the 5.
Interesting.
So they tried, as you said, they tried to make him work, and he just really didn't do much with it.
No, and then they kind of turned to Johnson midway through the season as the guy who would spell ETN, not Bigsby. And I was like, all right, this is interesting. And he just kept breaking off big runs. And he was far more involved. Like, for probably 4 years now, it's like, man, ETN is going to be a PPR monster. And he was better last year than he had been at any point of his career. But even at times, they would bring in Johnson as the pass catching back and throw to him and not ETN, which I found really surprising.
And they kind of treated him more in like a Derrick Henry-ish role at sometimes with ETN, like just getting those kind of touches and not a ton of the passing game. Yeah, again, to go back to ETN, my concern would just be like, can he get those, what do you have, 10, 11, 12 rushing touches? I don't know if that's who he is again this year.
Sure, but if he overachieves on that, he could be a top 5 running back.
Yeah. It definitely could be. Interesting enough, because I pulled it up while we were talking. Did you know ETN actually had a better touchdown percentage for his goal line rushes than Derrick Henry did? I mean, it's very minimal, but he scored on 45% of his goal line rushes. Derrick Henry was only 43%.
Super
close, but
I think that's somewhat misleading because whenever the Titans, not they were inside the red zone or inside the goal line all that often, but when they did, their first 2 plays were handoff to Derrick Henry every single time.
I know, he did have 16 attempts, so there you go.
So ETN and the running backs will take out of the equation pass catchers for the Jags. Obviously, Ridley's not there anymore. Christian Kirk is going at the highest, wide receiver 30, pick number 45. The rookie, Brian Thomas, is wide receiver number 43, pick number 72 overall. And then you have Evan Ingram, tight end 8, pick number 79. Gabe Davis, wide receiver 63, ADP right now of 133. How do you see this wide receiving core shaking down?
The order you said... But if you told me with something we just talked about with the Texans that I had to pick one at all their cost to try and stack, I would stack the living hell out of this team versus the Texans at cost. I think Christian Kirk is underrated for where he's going. Do I think Christian Kirk's going to be a top 15 wide receiver? No. But it's like everybody forgot what Christian Kirk did. And even if he only replicates what he just did last year, still a good value. And I think that Brian Thomas is underrated as a prospect. You and I talked about him a few weeks ago, or maybe even months ago at this point. I don't even remember. But I think Brian Thomas got overlooked because of this draft class. Most years he would have been in that tier 1, maybe even the first wide receiver off the board. Remember some of those plays for LSU were Brian Thomas. And if you tell me that he steps in, I think I said it to you. If I didn't, and I know I did on my show, is that I think Brian Thomas comes in and immediately puts up Calvin Ridley's numbers from last year. I think he's Calvin Ridley of last year, but I think he's going to do it more consistently, like where you're not going to get the highs and lows of Calvin Ridley, which might make some people steer away from him in best ball, but not at this cost. And then Gabe Davis, if I'm wrong, and Gabe Davis is even what he was 2 years ago with the Bills, now on the Jaguars, his cost is beyond great for what he could potentially do. So all these guys, the only one that leaves hesitation is just Evan Ingram, just because he's so volume dependent. And what if there's a little bit more spread out to the wide receivers versus Evan Ingram last year needing to be the 2 a lot. But the wide receivers, I think, play out in that order. But I actually would put the gap between Kirk and Thomas a lot closer, and I'd still be in on all 3.
And Zay Jones not being there has to help out Christian Kirk by the splits, right?
By the splits, yeah, the Zay Jones splits, and then I think just Zay Jones just not being there to like. There's just a connection. And the jokes aside about the splits, Trevor Lawrence just had a connection with Zay Jones in certain lineups. It was more about the defense that they were facing. It was more about versus the man or zone coverage that was with Zay Jones than it was actually the splits. I know you were being tongue in cheek with that, but it came a lot down to who was healthy between all 3 of them, and then who they were facing. But Zay Jones not being there, Gabe Davis takes his role, if not potentially more. Just because if you told me Gabe Davis versus Zay Jones, I'm going to take Gabe Davis.
So Brian Thomas at 72, a much better pick than Christian Kirk at 45.
Yes, but I still, again, I don't want everybody to think I don't like Kirk. I like both, but if you told me at only one being the best value, I think it is Brian Thomas.
Let's move to the Indianapolis Colts. Anthony Richardson, will he be okay for week 1? Reports suggest yes. What do you think?
I think yes. Will he be okay for the season is the bigger question. The problem with Anthony Richardson, and I know that people, I'm not falling into the crutch argument of running quarterbacks get hurt more. As we know, like FB Injury Doc has done the report on that, and it doesn't happen that much more than.
But he does. He got hurt in I think every game he played.
Well, so that's what I was going to bring up. The problem with Anthony Richardson is not the running, it's the style of running. Anthony Richardson runs like he's Cam Newton built. And that's the problem. Or Josh Allen built. He runs like he's another 50 pounds heavier, but he's not. He's built frail, at least at this point. And it's kind of, you go back to Robert Griffin, and what Robert Griffin would tell people is like, stop taking these hits. He would like look back like, hey, hindsight's 2020, but we saw it when it was happening. It's just sometimes run out of bounds. Stop taking people head on when you're built like that. That's why I have concerns about Anthony Richardson for the full season. Even Lamar. Lamar doesn't get hit as much as he could potentially get hit. So Anthony Richardson could be a top five. If you told me he played 17 games, I'd almost put money on he's a top five quarterback because we're playing fantasy. And that would put him in the conversation of like Justin Fields, Lamar Jackson over a full season of rushing for 1,000 yards, 1,100 yards. I just don't think he gets there. I don't think he's going to stay healthy, and it has nothing to do with him being a running quarterback. It's his style of running.
Anthony Richardson's being drafted as quarterback number 5, so ahead of CJ Stroud, who we talked about a little bit earlier, and that's pick number 57 right now. Do you think that's just right, or is that a bit too high for the risk that comes with it?
I'm okay with it because if he does get hurt, I'll have other quarterbacks as backup plans. Like I would love, because we're talking best ball too. We're not drafting other quarterbacks. If it was redraft, the cost there, I like that to be my only quarterback that I draft, because I don't really like spending a top 4 or 5 round pick and then being like, well, let me just back up another quarterback on my bench that I might never use if my guy stays healthy. If I'm drafting Jalen Hurts, I'm not even thinking about a second quarterback. I'll pick somebody off waivers. But in best ball, I'm a little bit more okay with it because it's already built in that I am going to be drafting a second quarterback. I am probably drafting even potentially a third. So that injury risk, I'm okay, because if Richardson plays 17, he's going to finish top 5. If he gets hurt, I know I'm probably going to fall into one of my other options, like even a Will Levis, since we're going to be talking about him in this division.
The Colts are plus 310 to win the division, so marginally behind the Jags. They have exactly the same win total at 8.5. However, people are shading the under of the 8.5 for the Colts, not the over. The coaching is exactly the same. Shane Steichen is back. Jim Bob Cooter still calling the plays in Indianapolis. And to take a look at their schedule, they have a week 14 bye. Then they're at Denver week 15, at home to the Tennessee Titans in week 16. Then they're at the New York Giants. How are you feeling about your former team and their defense this year?
I'm not. I think that's a great matchup to have in week 17, honestly.
So that's not bad. It's not like, I mean, Denver's defense got better after they got shellacked by the Dolphins last year. That kind of threw all their defensive stats out of whack, but they were pretty decent towards the end of the season. And I have no feel for the Titans whatsoever, whether they're going to be good, bad, like weirdly mediocre, but overachieve like they've done in the past, but they have a brand new system in there. Do you have any feel for the Titans and how they are as a fantasy matchup?
For defensively, I think that people overlooked that their defense was a little similar to the Broncos, a little bit better than people remember because they were so good in one aspect and so terrible in the other. Part of it's who they played, too. They didn't have a lot of changes in their starting lineup, which makes me say, like, yeah, pretty much the Titans from last year. I would say they're middle of the pack. Like, I'm not afraid of them, but I'm also not like, oh, you've got to smash against the Titans. So I think they're just middle of the road. I think the Giants are more favorable, except for, see, that's one that could change too. Like, jokes aside about the Giants, and because you said that, is their secondary looks supremely concerning, especially because they let so many corners walk. But their front, you know, we've seen the Giants Super Bowl winning team didn't have a very good secondary. Their front was so good. It let their corners sit back in extra coverage, and then it made up for it. That could be similar for the Giants, but on paper, as of today, I'd rather face the Giants than the Titans.
The Colts only have 3 players drawing interest in fantasy right now. We mentioned Anthony Richardson. He's pick number 57, quarterback number 5. Jonathan Taylor is running back number 5, pick number 16 off the board, with no backup running back being drafted for them at this time. Do you have faith that this is like the absolute bounce back of all bounce backs after what happened at the beginning of last year? Like, would you feel good with Jonathan Taylor in the second round as your running back 1?
Yes.
Okay.
I'd actually feel good with Jonathan Taylor as a top 4 running back. It just comes down to health, and I'm not going to play that. Like, even if Richardson goes down, I'm still fine with Jonathan Taylor. People already forgot, like when Jonathan Taylor was 100% last year, Jonathan Taylor was still Jonathan Taylor. We just got other people mixed in, and then as you mentioned, the injuries to start, Anthony Richardson getting hurt. But hell, if Anthony Richardson even plays 10 games, we've seen and we know what that does for the offense of opening things up for the running back. And as you mentioned, who are you drafting behind? This is clearly the answer of like nobody. Evan Hull, with Trey Sermon, the cast-off.
Macaulay Culkin in The Good Son.
Tyler Goodson. Yeah. Like, there's just nobody behind them. They don't even have a Zach Moss. Now, I actually wouldn't be surprised if they get a cast-off from another team that gets cut or there's a surprise there. But point being is I'm fine with Jonathan Taylor. Let's talk wide receivers because that's the person I'm not fine with.
Well, here's more of the macro question on Jonathan Taylor right now. So pick number 16, as I mentioned, that's 3 picks after Jahmyr Gibbs. That is 2 picks ahead of Saquon Barkley. I think I'd rather have Barkley.
I'd rather have Taylor. Here's the question that I was actually going to I thought of, and I'll push back in your mind. And if you had to rank the top 2 or 3 running backs in the NFL that should be on touches, I mean, Jonathan Taylor actually might be one. Like, who's getting more touches than Jonathan Taylor? Again, health aside, who's getting more touches than Jonathan Taylor on paper as of right now for 2024?
Henry, maybe, if things break his way.
I would still take Taylor. More touches.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a very compelling point. You might be right.
The workload's going to be like 80%. We're talking about the workload that Najee Harris even had for a few years ago before Jaylen Warren showed up. Well, no, but you just said, oh, God, we're also talking Najee Harris top 5 running back, and he's not Jonathan Taylor's skill set. Like that, I'm chasing the touches here and the skill set partly, but I can't see any running back. Like if you told me ones that should get 300 carries, like it might be Derrick Henry in that one, but Jonathan Taylor is going to get all that passing game work that Derrick Henry is not going to get.
So Michael Pittman is going at pick number 33, well above any of the. You hate it, just out on Michael Pittman.
Hate it, just because. Let's play the world again. Let Anthony Richardson stays healthy for most of the season, 12, 13, 14 games. It's the Baltimore Ravens. It's a very simple transition to go over, and the fact that look at the Ravens every single year with Lamar Jackson. The passing volume doesn't support anybody outside of Mark Andrews a couple years. And then you might have got a wide receiver in the mix. And sure, Michael Pittman is essentially their Mark Andrews because he's the one that's going to get that 6% volume. But even with that, we're not talking about Michael Pittman getting 150, 160 targets again. It's probably more like 130. And for that, I am not paying a top 15 wide receiver cost on somebody that's still a good number, but that's not the volume he got from the past. Plus, they added Mitchell. Plus, Josh Downs looked good as a rookie and had an early connection with Anthony Richardson. And not to be hindsight, haha, I told you. But I'm saying this as in there's a stylistic advantage for Josh Downs to Anthony Richardson that we talked about last year because of what we saw with Richardson in college and that type of wide receiver that he gravitates to. And you saw that with Pittman too, is there was a connection, but it was inconsistent at times. And I'm not saying Pittman can't return top 15, but I think it's more likely he's outside the top 15 and potentially even outside the top 20, 25 than he is inside the top 15 just because you have Downs, you have Mitchell, and you have a quarterback that is going to lead an offense that's not going to be passing 35, 40 times every single week.
So wide receiver number 24 is where he's coming off the board in underdog best ball drafts right now. That's after Metcalf, Diggs, Cooper Kupp, and one spot ahead of Zay Flowers, Tank Dell, T. Higgins, and George Pickens.
24?
24.
I thought you said 14. Did I mishear you? That's why. So 24 is not the worst at that spot.
Yeah, maybe I did say 14, and that was messing. Would you rather have Michael Pittman or Malik Neighbors this year?
Pittman.
Yeah, and he's going, 7 picks after.
Are we forgetting who the quarterback is for the Giants? That we're just Malik Neighbors, top 20 all of a sudden?
Hey, you just told me that Daniel Jones was Trevor Lawrence.
Touche. Look, you're making me cough.
Do you have any, Downs as a fantasy prospect? Do you like him? Because he's going after Mitchell now.
Not as a fantasy prospect. I don't hate him in case Mitchell doesn't do anything as a rookie, but the higher ceiling is with Mitchell.
Would you draft Mitchell?
Where's he going?
He's way down. He's outside the top 100.
Yes.
Let's see.
Way down, yes.
Mitchell is pick number 116, wide receiver number 57. Downs, 131, wide receiver 62.
They're both worth taking at that spot.
So like, if you were constructing a stack here, it would be like Richardson, Mitchell, Downs, and what, Jelani Woods? Or just no?
Jelani Woods would be. Jelani Woods would be the tight end, I think. But here's the problem with this stack. It's 2 or 3 people, and the third person might be Jonathan Taylor. It might not even be a second pass-catching option because we've seen that before. That's what I'm going to go back to. Is let's say Pittman is Mark Andrews. Let's say Pittman even comes back last year and does finish just inside the top 20. The second option, what's best case scenario? Like the reason I'm okay with Mitchell and Downs is because if one clearly beats out the other as the 2, and then clearly gets that volume, but let's even play that scenario. Still, what is that best case scenario in this offense? 40th at wide receiver, maybe 35th. And I think that's what people need to remember for this stack is that it's more contingent on Richardson and then his number 1 target, likely Pittman, and those staying healthy with Jonathan Taylor. A third option being a wide receiver or Jelani Woods, I just wouldn't count on it. And I like Jelani Woods. It's just, again, how many times have we done this with the Ravens? The answer usually is just nobody.
It's just Lamar.
Yeah, by the cake.
Titans. The Titans win total is 6.5. People are shading the under on that 6.5. They are 10-1 to win the AFC South, which probably isn't a terrible bet knowing the history of this division where random teams just do really well because they dominate within the division for reasons unknown. They do have a week 5 bye. However, every other one of these teams in this division is like week 12, week 13, week 14. So they're going to be playing basically straight through for 3 months. They end the season Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Jacksonville. That's not terrible from a fantasy perspective to end the season. And when we take a look at what is going on with them, they bring in Calvin Ridley to pair up with DeAndre Hopkins. They bring in Tony Pollard and let Derrick Henry walk. And you still have, what's his face, Tajay Spears, who... Do you think Tajay Spears will outscore Tony Pollard?
I think there's a world for it. I'm doing my top 5 breakout running backs this week, and Spears is in there. There's a chance that he's the more valuable running back. And we're talking about just last year. Tony Pollard, we do need to remember how terrible he was inside the goal line area.
Yes.
And it was bad. And let's even throw that out. Let's even just say, well, why should we expect Tajay Spears to be better inside the goal line and everything like that? But Tajay Spears had almost an identical yards after contact to his teammate, Derrick Henry. And granted, some of those are inflated by big run plays, but that's part of Spears' game. And then Spears beat Tony Pollard, as you can tell, I've already written this part of the article, beat him in yards per carry, yards per touch, efficiency after the touch actually was almost an entire yard, that yards after contact. He was a better running back on a per touch basis than Tony Pollard was last year. Yes, Tony Pollard was brought in and paid like he's going to be the lead, and maybe Spears is only 30 to 40% like he was. They don't even change Spears' role. They like him in that role. That's a possibility. There's also a good possibility that Spears ends up being better than Pollard, gets 55, 60% of the share on his end, and is a terrific pick for that. So I'm going to have a lot of Spears, and I also like the fact that we got the disappointment of what people thought was going to even be better for him for a rookie season because he's still not being priced up for what the potential is if he is the lead running back.
People are down on Pollard after last year, but he's still going higher than Spears right now. Pollard is running back number 29, pick number 100. Spears is running back number 34, pick number 112. Kind of reminds me of the Harris-Warren situation from last year when people really didn't know who to take and just pick the guy who's going for cheap.
And honestly, you could kind of take both at that point. Neither one of them are terrible picks because in a world where either one of them gets 60%, and is successful, even if Pollard was what he was last year, okay, worst case, you just netted out even. Like you didn't really lose anything by taking him there. But what if there's a world where Spears looks like trash in a second season and Pollard is back to somewhat what he was 2 years ago on the Titans for some reason? I did want to go back to one thing, though, because you were talking about their win total. I don't mind the over, and I don't mind that long shot for the division because the other piece, you didn't mention week 18 or week 12. Five of their final 7 games are division games. They smashed their entire division schedule for the end of the season. The only time they play anybody not in their in that range is they play Indianapolis in week 6.
Brian Callahan is now the head coach. He will call the plays coming over from Cincinnati. Do you think this offense is better now that they have Hopkins and Calvin Ridley at receiver?
I do. I think part of it will be Callahan, and I think part of it is this is coming from people have been following us together. I'm not a Will Levis fan. Let me make that clear. But there is a world where Will Levis does have talent enough to at least be a middle of the pack. Like, Will Levis could be Derek Carr. And I bring up Derek Carr again to say, like, even if you were middle of the pack, the 18th best quarterback in the league, Derek Carr, 18th best quarterback with Hopkins, with Calvin Ridley, with this offense, is going to make both of them valuable. So I think they're interesting picks. I think Calvin Ridley's numbers could be similar to what they were with just Jacksonville. If Will Levis takes that step forward, where I'm bringing that up to say, I don't hate Will Levis as my second quarterback, third quarterback, depending on how the draft went, as that late flyer and stack him in best ball. Again, talk about that schedule towards the end of the stretch is like, it's not like, what's the worst defense? I mean, I'm going back to, they really don't, on paper, they really don't have a scary defense.
Week 9?
Outside of that's actually what I was about to say, starting with New England in week 9. Outside of that, like, their worst one is at Jacksonville.
Not so bad. Ridley is going at pick number 61. That's wide receiver 35. Hopkins at pick 72, wide receiver number 42. Chig is going as tight end number 23, and that's pick number 192. Levis is quarterback 24 at pick number 180. So it's a pretty cheap stack if you want to get in on it.
And maybe you tell me, maybe you make the argument, why did everybody hate DeAndre Hopkins all of a sudden?
I don't know. He's old. Can't take him. He's too old.
1,000 yards, 6, 7, 8 touchdowns last year? He's top 25, and I know
how many of those came in that one game?
Oh, the one Will Levis game?
Yeah.
Hold on. I'll pull him up on this. I have another page open.
Yeah, he had like 200 yards and 3 touchdowns, didn't he?
Yeah. No, 128 yards and 3 touchdowns. But he had 3 of his 7 touchdowns. Yeah, he had 7 in that game. Still, my point being here is similar to the Diggs, Nico Collins. Why are we so certain draft wise by ADP? This is what people are saying. Why are we so certain that Ridley's going to be better than Hopkins with the Titans next year? Like, maybe it's stupid. Maybe he is old. Maybe he is washed and it's a dumb pick, but Hopkins at the cheaper cost, I think there's a world where DeAndre Hopkins is still top 25 and finishes in front of Calvin Ridley.
And you have 2 guys. Like we just talked about with the Texans, there's 3 guys and a tight end to divvy everything up. Like, do we really think that Treylon Burks is really making a comeback? Because I don't.
I don't even think Treylon Burks is third at this point. So, no. I think that this is a very clear pecking order, and the third is probably Okonkwo. I mean, it might be Tyler Boyd because Callahan likes Boyd, but I mean, we're talking about Westbrook Akina, Burks, as you mentioned, like Kyle Phillips. I know some people out there like been pumping him. I think this is a very clear Ridley Hopkins, and I don't even know if I want the third.
Let's draft the all.
The third actually, sorry. The third actually might be the combination of Pollard and Spears out of the backfield in the passing game.
Fair. Let's draft the all-fantasy team for this division. We'll draft a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, a tight end, and a flex, and 2 handcuffs, a handcuff receiver and a handcuff running back to look at later on. Who is the best fantasy quarterback in this division? Tony Richardson?
Anthony Richardson, yeah.
All right, so A-Rich. Who are the 2 running backs? Jonathan Taylor and who?
Ooh, that's such a good question because I don't think it's a lock that it's ETN given if Joe Mixon on that offense and it just churns out again. I will lean to ETN, but I don't think it's as close. I don't think it's as far as the gaps are showing in ADP right now.
So you think that ETN and Mixon are far closer than JT and ETN?
Yes.
Okay. 2 receivers. Collins and Pittman?
I mean, I could see a case for Diggs. I wouldn't put Hopkins here now. This is actually. Can we just pick the flex at the same time?
Sure. Is the flex Mixon or is it Diggs?
I go 3 wide receivers.
All right, so we'll go Diggs is the flex, Collins and Pittman.
I don't know. I might actually take Kirk over Diggs.
Really?
Yeah.
Like in this spot. I mean, doesn't Mixon just make them more sense here then as the flex?
but if we're talking about for fantasy, no, you want the wide receiver over the running back anyway.
I think you would just want the better. I think you would want the better player who scores more fantasy points. That's the way that I always tend to look at it.
I just don't know if he will. And I'm going to have a lot of Mixon. Come back to this. Are we only doing 2 wide receivers, or are we doing 3 wide receivers?
We're doing 2 wide receivers.
You're making this difficult. Mixon, fine.
All right, so Mixon.
I think being nitpicky in the wide receiver 20s for Diggs, Kirk, Pittman versus, in my opinion, Mixon as a fringe RB1. You're right. When you talk it out like that, I'll say Mixon.
Tight end, Evan Ingram.
Yeah, I think so.
Right,
don't love it, but I mean, where else are you going to go?
Yeah, I mean, we're confined to just the AFC South. So Evan Ingram is the tight end for this team. The backup wide receiver that I had as a flyer would be Noah Brown.
As a flyer?
Yeah.
I could see it. So it has to be definitively not a starter?
Yes.
Well, because I was going to say, I like Brian Thomas.
Yeah, he's being drafted 71st.
Easily be the stommer. Yeah. Well, where's Gabe Davis?
Gabe Davis is down there too. Low? Yeah, Gabe Davis is around Noah Brown territory. Or he's higher than Noah Brown, but not you like Gabe Davis more than Noah Brown? Okay, yeah. Gabe Davis. We'll switch the pick. And the handcuff running back to take in this division. Spears doesn't really count because he's being drafted.
Oh.
He's being drafted. He's running back number 34.
Oh, okay. Fair. I get your point. So then it comes down to there's nobody on the Colts. Tennessee doesn't count now, so now we're down to
Dearness Johnson or Dameon Pierce.
Or Dearness, I guess it's Dameon Pierce, unfortunately.
Dameon Pierce. Poor guy. Guy was so good 2 years ago.
Can't believe I just said unfortunately. Sorry, Dameon Pierce. I didn't mean to be rude.
Yeah, hating on your favorite team and your favorite player, Dameon Pierce.
Yeah.
All right, that will do it. Dipping the toe back in the water of football division preview for the AFC South. We'll have all of the divisions coming on the Pat Mayo Experience, so sub to that right now for the audio podcast. You want the video, that's on Mayo Media Network. And what sort of content are you doing? And when does full-blown NFL season start for you?
It's essentially kind of here. It's the enunciation you put on doing sounded so condescending. What kind of content are you doing? I got my breakout running backs this week and then breakout wide receivers and breakout tight ends. I already did quarterbacks, but with all the rookies and stuff, there was no way to do a top 5. So I did likelihood of quarterbacks getting to the QB1 territory. So that's already out. And then, you know how it goes. Mid-July, third week of July is when our draft gets going to come out. Because we got to get it. Fortunately, Pat, you know what? We're at the world now where we didn't have to. Remember when we had to be like, get it out the day after July 4th. We got to go. July 5th is the time. We don't have to do that anymore.
Well, you can go to theathletic.com to find all of Jake's work. Follow me at @PME. Smash a like, sub to the channel, do all that fun stuff, and use code MAYO and Underdog Fantasy right now for a deposit bonus of up to $200. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.
Mayo Experience! Experience!